They told her she was just a medic. They forbade her from even touching the sniper rifle. When enemy fire pinned down her entire unit and their marksmen fell, she faced an impossible choice between following orders and watching her teammates die. What happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who had spent months being dismissed as the weakest link. Which city of the world are you watching from today? If stories like this resonate with you, please consider subscribing. The pre-dawn air at Forward Operating Base Talon carried the familiar scent of diesel fuel and dust that had become Corporal Senna Hawthorne's morning ritual. She moved through the medical bay with the quiet precision of someone who understood that in this place, preparation meant the difference between bringing soldiers home alive or in body bags. Her hands worked methodically through the inventory. Morphine vials aligned with military precision, tourniquets tested for tension, pressure bandages counted twice. Each movement deliberate, each item placed with the care of someone who knew that chaos would soon demand perfection. The ritual calmed her in ways that sleep never could, a meditation of preparation that had kept her grounded through 18 months of deployments. "Hope you brought extra band-aids today, Doc." Staff Sergeant Knox Meridian's voice cut through the morning stillness like a dull blade. He leaned against the doorframe, his Barrett .50 caliber rifle slung casually across his shoulder. The weapon seemed less like equipment and more like a badge of superiority, worn with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the hierarchy. Real soldiers might get real wounds today. Senna didn't look up from her work. Her fingers continued their methodical check of supplies, each item receiving the same careful attention, regardless of the mockery floating through the air around her. "I've got what we need, Sergeant." Knox's laugh held no warmth, just the familiar edge that came with men who had decided someone else's value before they'd ever bothered to learn their name. "What we need is someone who can put holes in the enemy instead of patching up holes in us." He straightened as footsteps approached, the sound of authority making its morning rounds. Captain Ridge Blackwood entered the bay with clipboard in hand and expression as rigid as his posture. Everything about the man suggested someone who had learned that flexibility was a luxury that got soldiers killed. His eyes swept the medical station with the same systematic attention he gave every aspect of his command. "Final briefing in 5 minutes," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Humanitarian convoy through Widow's Canyon. High probability of contact." The words settled over the room like a familiar blanket of tension. Widow's Canyon had earned its reputation through the blood of soldiers who had underestimated its narrow passages and perfect ambush positions. Every person in the unit knew the statistics, knew the odds, knew that some of them might not be coming back. Blackwood's eyes settled on Senna, with the weight of absolute authority pressing down like a physical force. "Hawthorne, I want to be crystal clear about something. Your job is healing. Period. That Barrett stays with qualified personnel only." The words hit like a physical blow, though Senna's face betrayed nothing more than professional acknowledgement. Her fingers paused for just a moment on the zipper of her medical pack, a hesitation so brief that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed it. Then her hands resumed their work, steady and methodical as always. Specialist Theron Castle appeared beside Knox like a shadow seeking validation from its source. The younger man nodded approval at his sergeant's earlier words, adding his own voice to the chorus of dismissal. "Leave the real work to the real warriors, medic girl." The casual cruelty in his tone suggested someone who had learned to measure his own worth by diminishing others. Castle had been Knox's constant companion since joining the unit, absorbing not just tactical knowledge, but the sergeant's attitudes about who belonged where in the complex ecosystem of military hierarchy. Near the entrance, Private Jackson Vale shifted uncomfortably, his 19-year-old face struggling to hide emotions that felt too big for the situation. This would be his first convoy through the valley that had claimed so many American lives, and the fear in his young eyes was as obvious as his desperate attempt to conceal it. His hands moved restlessly, checking and rechecking equipment that had already been inspected twice. After the others dispersed to their final preparations, Vale approached Senna's station with the tentative steps of someone seeking reassurance from the only person who had never treated him like a burden. The medical bay offered a kind of sanctuary, a place where questions didn't feel like admissions of weakness. "Doc?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the uncertainty that came with youth facing mortality for the first time. "You ever been scared before a mission?" Senna looked up from her pack, really seeing him for the first time that morning. The tremor in his hands, the way he kept adjusting his gear, the slight sheen of perspiration despite the cool morning air. She recognized all the signs of someone whose body was preparing for something his mind hadn't quite accepted yet. "Fear is just your body getting ready to do something important," she said quietly, her voice carrying an unexpected authority that seemed to come from someplace deeper than medical training. "Control your breathing. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. Your father teach you that?" Vale shook his head, something painful flickering across his young features. "Never knew him." "Mine did." The words came out softer than intended, carrying weight that had nothing to do with standard combat breathing techniques. For a moment, something distant flickered in her eyes, a memory or knowledge that belonged to a different version of herself. Then she returned to her preparations, the moment passing like a shadow across still water. 20 minutes later, the convoy assembled in the motor pool under a sky that promised heat and dust and the kind of visibility that made snipers dream and foot soldiers pray. 3 Humvees and 1 medical vehicle, 12 soldiers heading into what the locals called the Valley of Widows. The name had been earned through generations of warfare, a place where the geography itself seemed designed to create orphans and grieving families. Senna climbed into the medical vehicle, settling into the seat she had occupied on dozens of similar missions. But her eyes moved across the terrain with an intensity that had nothing to do with looking for potential casualty collection points. Range estimation, wind assessment, visibility calculations. Her mind processed tactical information with the automatic precision of someone whose training went far deeper than emergency medicine. Knox secured his Barrett with ceremonial care, making sure everyone saw the weapon that marked him as the unit's primary designated marksman. The rifle was more than equipment to him. It was identity, status, proof of his value, in a world where value was measured in very specific ways. "This baby's got a kill radius of 2 miles, he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone displaying a prized possession. "But don't worry, Doc. I'll keep the scary stuff away from your first aid kit." The mockery rolled off him easily, practiced and casual. It had become such a routine part of their interactions that it felt almost ritualistic, a way of maintaining the established order of things. Knox was the warrior. Senna was the medic. The roles were clear, the boundaries established, the hierarchy maintained. Blackwood's voice crackled over the radio, with the authority of someone who had learned that survival depended on everyone staying exactly where they belonged. "All units maintain operational security. Everyone sticks to their role. No heroes, no exceptions." As the convoy rolled toward the canyon, Senna's fingers unconsciously traced the outline of something beneath her body armor. A small silver cross that caught the morning light, something that looked like standard religious jewelry, but felt heavier than faith alone could account for. The metal was warm against her skin, carrying the weight of memory and training and choices that had shaped her into someone her teammates had never bothered to truly see. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor, and somewhere in those shadows, enemy fighters were already taking position. They moved with the patience of hunters, who knew their prey would come to them, settling into firing positions that had been used for ambushes since before American boots had ever touched Afghan soil. The convoy entered Widow's Canyon like a thread being drawn through the eye of a needle, and everyone understood that some threads got cut in the process. Widow's Canyon earned its name from the wives left behind by soldiers who never made it through the narrow passage. The road wound between towering rock walls that provided perfect cover for ambushes, natural firing positions that had been carved by wind and water into ideal sniper nests. As their convoy entered the canyon's mouth, every soldier felt the weight of those stone walls pressing down like the sides of a tomb that hadn't been sealed yet. Senna rode in the medical vehicle, ostensibly monitoring communications and preparing for potential casualties. But her eyes moved across the ridgelines with systematic precision, reading terrain not for medical staging areas, but for threat assessment, wind direction, visibility corridors, elevation advantages, fields of fire. The calculations ran through her mind automatically, muscle memory from training that had nothing to do with treating wounded, but everything to do with staying alive long enough to treat anyone. The canyon walls rose on both sides like ancient sentinels, their surfaces scarred by decades of warfare. Every shadow could hide a rifle barrel. Every outcropping could conceal an enemy position. The narrow road forced the convoy into single file, eliminating maneuverability and creating the perfect kill zone for anyone patient enough to wait for the right moment. Overwatch positions looked clear. Knox's voice came through the radio from the lead vehicle, carrying his usual confidence, but with an edge that suggested even his arrogance had limits. But I don't like how quiet it is out here. Feels like something waiting to happen. The words had barely finished crackling through the radio when the world exploded into chaos and fire. The lead Humvee erupted in a ball of flame and twisted metal, as an improvised explosive device tore through its undercarriage with the force of concentrated hatred. The explosion echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, the sound bouncing back and forth until it became a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Immediately, coordinated rifle fire erupted from concealed positions along both ridgelines, muzzle flashes, winking like deadly stars from firing positions that had been prepared and waiting. The convoy was caught in a perfect kill box, trapped between walls of stone with nowhere to run, and enemy fighters who had all the advantages of preparation and position. Bullets sparked off armor plating and shattered windshields, filling the air with the distinctive crack and whine of high-velocity rounds seeking flesh and bone. "Contact! Contact!" Blackwood's voice screamed over the radio as his leadership training kicked in, trying to impose order on chaos that had no interest in being controlled. "All units find cover, return fire, get those guns up." Senna was moving before the echo of the explosion had finished bouncing off the canyon walls. She grabbed her medical pack with one hand and rolled out of the vehicle as rounds sparked off the metal where her head had been moments before. The tactical training kicked in automatically, procedures that had been drilled into muscle memory until they became instinct. Assess the threat, find cover, establish fields of fire, begin treating casualties. Her body moved with fluid precision between cover points, using terrain and abandoned vehicles to mask her movement from enemy observation. Every step was calculated, every position chosen for maximum protection and medical access to potential casualties. She reached the first wounded soldier before most of the unit had finished processing what was happening. Knox's voice cut through the chaos, with desperation replacing his earlier confidence. "I've got eyes on 2 shooters, ridgeline north, engaging targets." The distinctive boom of the Barrett echoed through the canyon, a sound that should have brought comfort and tactical advantage. But instead of the confident follow-up she expected, Senna heard Knox curse over the radio with pain and frustration. A spray of blood hit the rocks beside his position, bright red against gray stone. "I'm hit. Shoulders completely torn up." Knox's voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by the raw honesty of someone discovering their own mortality. "Can't maintain position. Can't work the rifle." Theron moved to assist his sergeant, but enemy fire had found their range with deadly precision. Shrapnel from a near miss sent the specialist tumbling down a rocky slope, his body going limp as consciousness left him before he hit the bottom. The Barrett skittered across the rocks, with metallic scraping sounds, coming to rest 20 feet away from any cover, exposed and abandoned like hope itself. "Where are our marksmen?" Blackwood's desperate voice crackled over the radio, his usual command authority cracking under the weight of watching his soldiers die. "We need suppressing fire on those positions. Someone get on that rifle." Senna low-crawled toward Knox's position, pressing herself against the canyon wall as bullets chipped stone inches from her face. Rock fragments stung her cheek, and the smell of cordite filled her nostrils with each breath. When she reached him, blood was seeping through his fingers where he gripped his shoulder, his face pale with shock, and the dawning realization that invincibility had always been an illusion. "How bad is it, Doc?" Knox asked, though his eyes already knew the answer from the amount of blood pooling beneath him. "Bad enough." Senna was already cutting away his sleeve, her hands working with practiced efficiency to assess the damage. "But you'll live if we can get you out of here." She applied pressure to the wound, feeling the torn muscle and shattered bone beneath her fingers. Knox grimaced as pain shot through his shoulder, but his eyes never left the abandoned rifle. "That Barrett. Someone needs to get on it. Someone who can actually use it." He looked at her with desperation bleeding through the pain. "How do you know exactly where those shooters are positioned?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from the gunfire. Senna's hands had been moving automatically to stop his bleeding, but her eyes had been tracking enemy positions with the systematic precision of someone reading a tactical situation. She had been unconsciously calculating ranges, wind compensation, target priority, information that had nothing to do with medical training. 2 primary positions, approximately 800 meters, she heard herself say, the words coming out with military precision. "Winds coming southeast at about 12 knots, gusting to 15. They've got overlapping fields of fire covering all our approach routes." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she had revealed, but the damage was already done. Knox stared at her through the haze of pain and shock, seeing something in her eyes that had never been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, hidden beneath the careful facade of medical professionalism. What kind of medic talks like a designated marksman? Before she could answer, Private Vale's scream cut through the gunfire like a blade through flesh. The young soldier had taken a round through his thigh, blood pumping out in bright arterial spurts that meant he had minutes before blood loss became critical. Senna was beside him in seconds, her hands working with practiced efficiency to apply a tourniquet, fighting against time and physiology to keep him alive. "They're going to kill us all, aren't they, Doc?" Vale's eyes were wide with terror and the shock of seeing his own blood painting the rocks beneath him. His young face had gone pale, and she could see him struggling to process the reality that death had come calling with his name on it. Another teammate fell with a wet thud and a cry that was cut short. Then another, the enemy fire systematically working through their positions with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. The ambush had been planned and executed with professional precision, and without counter-sniper fire to suppress the enemy positions, they could pick off the convoy at their leisure. Blackwood's voice over the radio had gone from commanding to desperate, authority cracking under the weight of helplessness. "All units, we need options. We're getting chopped up down here. Someone give me something." Senna's eyes tracked to the Barrett, lying in the open like a lifeline that no one could reach. 20 feet of exposed ground separated them from the weapon that could turn the tide, if someone could get to it. If someone knew how to use it. If someone was willing to risk everything for the chance to save everyone else. Knox followed her gaze, reading something in her expression that made him look at her with new eyes. "Even if you could get to it, Doc, that's not some hunting rifle. Takes years to learn that weapon system. Takes training that most soldiers never get." "I know what it takes," Senna said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with medical school or battlefield medicine. Something in her tone made Knox forget about his wounded shoulder for a moment. The quiet medic, who had patched him up dozens of times, who never raised her voice, never pushed back against their mockery. was staring at that rifle with the eyes of someone who understood exactly what it could do in the right hands. Another explosion rocked the canyon, closer this time. Another scream echoed off the walls. Another soldier down. Another life bleeding out on rocks that had absorbed too much American blood already. Blackwood's voice crackled over the radio one more time, desperation bleeding through the static. "If anyone has ideas, this would be a really good time to share them." Senna looked at Vale, his young face pale from blood loss but alive because of her quick work with the tourniquet. She looked at Knox, tough as nails Knox, who had never shown her anything but dismissive contempt, now depending on her to keep him breathing. She looked at her teammates, pinned down and dying, while she followed orders to stay in her assigned role, to be what others had decided she should be, instead of what she actually was. The silver cross beneath her body armor felt heavy against her chest, a weight she had carried for 8 years since the funeral, where they had folded a flag and handed it to a teenage girl whose father had taught her that sometimes healing required a different kind of precision altogether. Time moved differently in the space between life and death, each second stretching like pulled wire, while bullets cracked overhead and her teammates bled into the canyon floor. Senna could hear her own heartbeat, could feel each grain of sand beneath her elbows as she low-crawled toward the abandoned Barrett. 20 feet felt like 20 miles, with enemy rounds seeking flesh. But she moved with the fluid precision of someone who had done this before, in places her teammates would never know about. "Hawthorne!" Blackwood's voice cut through the gunfire, like a blade through silk, carrying all the authority of rank and regulation. "Stand down immediately. That's a direct order." But Senna was already reaching for the rifle, her hands finding the familiar weight of the weapon that had been both teacher and burden for more years than her teammates could imagine. The Barrett felt like coming home and betraying everything she had chosen to become, all at the same moment. Her fingers moved across the weapon with automatic familiarity, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. She chambered around with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed, each action flowing into the next, with mechanical precision. Stock to shoulder, cheek to stock, eye to scope, breathing settling into the rhythm her father had drilled into her when she was barely old enough to hold the weapon steady. The weight distribution, the trigger pull, the scope picture, all of it as natural as breathing. Through the scope, the world transformed into mathematics and physics, wind speed and bullet drop, range estimation and target acquisition. The chaos of the firefight faded into background noise as her training took over, turning her into something her teammates had never seen before. 847 meters to the primary target. Wind coming southeast at 12 knots with gusts to 15. Elevation advantage favoring the enemy position. The enemy sniper materialized in her crosshairs, like a ghost becoming solid, unaware that death was already calculating the precise angle of his destruction. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages, someone who had never imagined that the quiet medic crawling through the rocks below possessed skills that could reach out across nearly half a mile and touch him with finality. Senna's breathing slowed to the combat rhythm that lived in her muscle memory, inherited from a father who had taught her that sometimes saving lives required taking them with surgical precision. Her heartbeat steadied, her vision narrowed, and for a moment she was 16 again, prone behind this same type of rifle while a grizzled Delta Force operator made minute adjustments to her position. "See the target, honey." Her father's voice echoed across the years, as clear as if he were lying beside her in the rocks. "Be the target, then make the target go away." The first shot thundered through the canyon like the voice of judgment itself, the sound bouncing off the stone walls and rolling back on itself until it became a continuous roar. 847 meters away, the enemy sniper jerked backward and disappeared from his position, his rifle clattering down the rocks as his body followed gravity into the shadows below. Knox, still bleeding but now staring in absolute disbelief, whispered words that barely carried over the echo of gunfire. "Sweet Mother of Mercy, What was that shot? But Senna was already acquiring the second target, her hands working the bolt action with mechanical precision. Fresh round chambered, scope picture acquired, breathing controlled, heart rate steady. Another shooter, different position, 920 meters. Adjust for the increased range, compensate for the slight crosswind, account for the elevated firing position. The second shot echoed off the canyon walls with the same thunderous authority as the first. And another enemy position went silent, as death reached out across the distance with mathematical certainty. The shooter had been in the middle of acquiring his own target when Senna's bullet found him, turning his moment of focus into his final moment of anything at all. "Who in the world is she?" Theron's voice crackled over the radio. The specialist having regained consciousness just in time to witness their quiet medic systematically dismantling an entire enemy ambush, with shots that belonged in sniper legend rather than battlefield reality. One by one, Senna eliminated targets with surgical precision that defied everything her teammates thought they knew about her. Each shot was perfect, each kill instantaneous, each enemy position silenced before its occupant had time to understand that death had found their range. Years of suppressed training poured out through her fingertips, guided by muscle memory that had been buried beneath bandages and medical textbooks but never forgotten. Between shots, memories flashed like muzzle flares in her mind, scenes from a childhood that had been anything but ordinary. A younger Senna, maybe 16, prone behind this same type of rifle, while a battle-hardened man in Delta Force insignia made minute corrections to her stance. Hours spent on remote ranges, perfecting techniques while other teenagers attended school dances and worried about homework assignments. "Your mother thinks I'm pushing you too hard." Her father's voice came back to her across the years. "But someday you might need to save lives with this skill set. Sometimes the only way to heal is to hurt the right people." A flag-draped coffin appeared in her memory, surrounded by men in dress uniforms, who spoke in hushed tones about legendary accuracy and missions that would never be declassified. A teenage girl, in a black dress, accepting condolences from warriors who had served alongside her father, men who understood that she had inherited more than just his eyes. Her own voice came back to her, harsh with teenage rebellion and the pain of loss. "I'm not going to be like him. I'm not going to be a killer. I'm going to save lives, not take them." The words had been a promise to herself, a way of processing grief that felt too large for one person to carry. The canyon fell silent, except for the echo of her final shot, the last enemy position eliminated with the same clinical precision as the first. 7 targets engaged, 7 targets eliminated, 0 misses. The kind of shooting that earned legends and built reputations among people who understood what it meant to reach out across impossible distances and touch someone with finality. Senna carefully engaged the rifle's safety and set the Barrett down with the same reverence she had shown her medical equipment that morning. The weapon that had defined her father's career and shaped her childhood now lay silent in the rocks, having spoken its piece in the language that mattered most when everything was on the line. She reached beneath her body armor and pulled out what her teammates had assumed was a simple religious cross, but which was actually her father's shooting medal from a competition that had taken place before she was born. The silver caught the sunlight, reflecting memories of a man who had taught her that sometimes the greatest act of healing required the most precise act of harm. Captain Blackwood approached slowly, his rigid composure completely shattered by what he had just witnessed. The by-the-book officer, who had spent months treating her as nothing more than a medic, was now seeing her for what she actually was, and the revelation had left him struggling to process the gap between assumption and reality. As he stopped beside her position, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He rendered a slow, respectful salute. "Corporal Hawthorne," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with recognition. "I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. I owe all of us an apology." Senna picked up her medical pack and moved toward Vale, who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and confusion that seemed to sum up the entire unit's reaction. The young soldier, who had sought her reassurance that morning, was now seeing her through completely different eyes, trying to reconcile the gentle medic with the deadly marksman. "How long have you been able to shoot like that, Doc?" Vale asked, his voice carrying wonder and something that might have been relief at discovering their quiet medic was actually the most dangerous person in the unit. "Long enough," she said, kneeling to check his tourniquet and assess his wound for signs of complications. "But I chose to heal instead of hurt. Today I had to do both, and I hope I never have to again." Knox, still gripping his wounded shoulder but now looking at her with something approaching reverence, shook his head in amazement. "Why didn't you ever tell us who you really were? Why let us treat you like you were less than what you are?" Senna looked up from Vale's wound, meeting the eyes of each teammate who had dismissed her, underestimated her, treated her like she was the weakest link in a chain that had turned out to be anchored by her strength. Her voice carried no anger, no bitterness, just the quiet certainty of someone who had always known exactly who she was. "You never asked what I could do," she said simply, returning to her medical work with the same focused attention she had given to eliminating enemy positions. "You only cared about what you thought I was supposed to do." As medical evacuation helicopters approached in the distance, their rotors beating against the canyon walls like mechanical heartbeats, Senna returned to what she had always chosen to be: a medic, a healer, someone who had decided that saving lives mattered more than taking them. But now her teammates understood something fundamental about the woman they had served alongside for months without truly seeing. She had not become a medic because she could not be a warrior. She had become a medic despite being the most lethal warrior among them, because she had chosen a different path than the one her training had prepared her for. The Barrett lay beside her, offered silently by Knox as a permanent assignment, recognition that she had earned the right to carry the weapon that marked elite status. Senna looked at it for a long moment, then shook her head with the same gentle certainty she brought to treating wounds. "I know who I am," she said, securing the last of Vale's bandages and preparing him for evacuation. "And now all of you do too."